Welcome to Curator's Corner. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. I'm hoping everyone is keeping well and keeping engaged. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion of bioterrorism with one of my favorite advisory board members and favorite people in general, Malcolm Nance. And the conversation is going to be led by our wonderful historian and curator, Vince Houghton. Without further ado, I'm turning you over to two really fascinating people.
Thank you, Amanda. Welcome back to Curator's Corner. If this is your first time joining us, special welcome to you. I'm joined today by a great friend of the museum, great friend of mine, someone who, if you've been paying attention to anything we've done at the museum in the last decade plus, you've certainly seen Malcolm's face more than once. A brief introduction, it would take me about 20 minutes to do his whole career. But Malcolm was a career counterterrorism and intelligence officer for the U.S. government, special operations, homeland security, and intelligence agencies, with over 33 years of experience in combating radical extremism. He's an honorably retired U.S. Navy Arabic-speaking intelligence collections operator, field interrogator, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape specialist, and founder of the Advanced Terrorism, Abduction, Hostage Survival School. He spent more than 2 decades on clandestine anti-terrorism and counterterrorism intelligence operations everywhere from the Middle East to North Africa to the Balkans to South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, in direct support of both special operations and the intelligence community. Now, why is he here today, other than we love having conversations with Malcolm? During his time working counterterrorism, he attended the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases Bioterrorism course, which certainly is apt for the world that we're living in here today. And so we wanted to sit down with Malcolm and talk to him not only about this course, but about the more general idea of bioterrorism and even biological weapons use potentially by countries around the world. So welcome, Malcolm. If you could start talking a bit about, going from chasing bad guys around the Middle East and being an Arab linguist to sitting in classrooms at U.S. Army AMRID, learning about little bugs and microscopic organisms, had to be a bit of a game changer. So what was this course like, and what did they teach you that was really eye-opening at the time?
Well, first, when you look at it in the continuum of everything that happens in the world of terrorism, anti-terrorism, counterterrorism, a course like this wouldn't actually be out of the ordinary. What was out of the ordinary was that this course preceded a biological terrorist attack on the United States that occurred about 2 weeks after 9/11. Many of you, if you're youngins, there was this time period back when September 11th happened, and within 2 weeks of that, on September 17th, someone in the United States started mailing powdered packages of an actual biological weapon, anthrax. Anthrax is an animal-borne disease. When inhaled by, these spores are inhaled by humans. They create essentially, they introduce a pathogen into the lungs, and you suffer respiratory failure, and you die a slightly slow and horrible death. This actually happened, and it was the U.S. postal system that was the dispersal mechanism for these weapons. I had gone to, because I am a cryptologist, even though I do very little code breaking. As an Arabic linguist, my job was to collect information from our adversaries around the world, whether through electronic means, using radio communications intercepts, computer intercepts. Later on, that went into what we call dark cryptology, right? Hacking, cracking, and freaking. But no matter what you do, it all comes out into a foreign language, right? That's the first thing you should learn about doing intelligence collection anywhere outside the United States, even in the United States. Everything that is done is by people who speak a foreign language. So even if you crack a code, it comes out into Arabic. From time to time, I get these little occasional quips on the internet that I was a linguist. Yeah, I was a linguist, but so was Alan Turing when he was a German linguist cracking codes in World War II. Everything comes out to a language. That led me into other components of special collection, where I was tasked out to other agencies and subunits in the special operations world and the clandestine intelligence world, where people like me, who were of my hue, who were of my skin color, were just a little more valuable in terms of not being detected while collecting information. But throughout all of my time in what I call the good old days of terrorism, that's the early 1980s, which was cast off from the 1970s, where terrorist groups were very clearly defined. And you could tell they were clearly defined because all you had to do was watch Hollywood, right? They were all like Die Hard. Die Hard's character, the chief terrorist in Die Hard, was actually a German who was out to make money using terrorism. These groups existed in the 1970s, Red Army Faction, Baader-Meinhof, Aktion Direct, combative communist cells that, were essentially people going around Europe and creating mayhem as supported by the KGB. The Middle East was even more clearly defined. You had Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Palestine Liberation Organization, real paramilitary organizations that carried out military-style operations. But all through this period, we had nation states that were trying to acquire chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. Libya had the Tarhuna Nuclear Research Facility, which also doubled as a chemical and biological research facility. A lot of time spent on that target. Syria had biological weapons and some fundamental chemical weapons supplied to them by the Soviet Union at the time. Same thing with Iraq. Iraq would later go on to develop a very robust chemical weapons profile and actually use them in war against Iran, and was tampering around, of course, with biological weapons. Same thing with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So this thread of biological weapons being a possibility was often discussed, but it rarely came up as an operational mission. I mean, for people in my world, there were other agencies and sub-units that were specifically tasked for nuclear weapons and biological weapons. But by the late 1990s, we started getting a lot more intelligence about this group that very early on we called the GIJ, right? Global Islamic Jihad, because we had no way of characterizing who they were other than what they were espousing. By 1997, that would congeal into the name Al-Qaeda al-Jihad, which means the headquarters of the Holy War, which FBI cut that short to Al-Qaeda. And they were led by a former son of a Saudi billionaire, the richest man in Saudi Arabia, one of 52 children, named Osama bin Laden, who was actually working for the Saudi government in Afghanistan during the 1980s. So these organizations, as they started to escalate, also showed a levy of technological savvy. And I mean, they were the first. I mean, Al-Qaeda, for example, was the first group that I had seen outside of what we call a class 1 terrorist group like North Korean intelligence, right? A state-run agency, intelligence agency, that was using like encrypted communications. They used mobile phones, some of the first mobile phones that had like 10 kilobytes of data transfer capacity, right? And they would put messages inside these phones and would literally carry the propaganda or orders or whatever. It was a very interesting time because technology back then was really crude, but Al-Qaeda was on the cutting edge. They had a lot of young guys. Also the first group to do a lot of video and social media propaganda. Very fascinating group. But what happened was, by the time 1997 rolled around and they were about to declare themselves in a global holy war against the United States, which they initiated with a speech and then 6 months later blew up 2 American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, that's when we realized that we were being outgained by these people. But one of the things that they were constantly on the lookout for was chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And later on, by year 2000, I would roll into one of their facilities that had already been blasted to bits by the U.S. government, the Durunta Terrorist Biological Chemical Training Facility, or testing facility in just outside of Jalalabad, Afghanistan. And this was famous for their videos of them using chemical and biological agents against monkeys and dogs and goats. So it was out there. So USAMRIID, which is the U.S. Army Medical Institute for Infectious Diseases, they're a really cutting-edge organization. In the same way that they were ahead of this pandemic that we're going through right now, they were very, very aware that the kind of vectors, the kind of infectious diseases which existed in nature could be cultured and then brought in and then weaponized and used by terrorist groups, either synthesized themselves or were actually given to them by state actors. And when I meant state actors, at that time, it was the Soviet Union. And for those of you who don't really read a lot about the Soviet Union, that country created boatloads of biological weapons. And they took those biological weapons and actually put them in ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and created ballistic warheads that would have thousands upon thousands of crystal tubes and balls that would shower after it came out of space over a U.S. city and explode into this cloud that would disperse smallpox, a rare disease called rabbit fever, also known as tularemia, and other horrible, horrible diseases by the tens of thousands of liters. So instead of a bomb vaporizing, Poughkeepsie, they would use biological weapons. And it was a great fear that they would give these bioweapons to a terrorist group to further their aims. And that's why USAMRIID had this course called Biological Weapons in Terrorism. And it was a fascinating program.
Well, if anyone was around at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, if you're old enough to remember that, a lot of the fear in the 1990s was the spread of loose nukes, as they described it, the nuclear weapons that had been housed in the different republics that now were their own countries. Many of them ended in Stan and had close ties to Iran and other places. A lot of people didn't give a lot of attention to loose biological weapons, even though in 1972, we signed an agreement to end our use and even offensive research into both biological and chemical weapons. The Soviets did too. They lied through their teeth. They continued to produce them all the way through the end of the Soviet Union and even to the Russian era. And I think what's really misunderstood, perhaps, is nuclear weapons are really, really hard to make, right? They take a lot of infrastructure, right? The science is relatively straightforward, but you need to have the ability to separate uranium. You need to have the ability to process it. Biowarfare has been around for centuries, if not longer. And a lot of people maybe have heard the story, and different armies, depending on who's telling it, of plague victims being catapulted into castles under siege. That is, an early form of biowarfare. And it's not all that complicated to create hosts for these weapons. And, you look at the idea of this kind of an attack being the true form of terrorism, right? You've talked about what is the root word of terrorism, right? Terrorism is psychological. It's about scaring the hell out of people. It's not about doing massive damage. We know now in the last, 5 months how terrifying this could be. This is a natural pandemic, not an artificially created pandemic. So you could talk a little bit about, did U.S. Army AMRIID, did their course talk about social unrest and the kind of psychological impact? And you think of the movie Outbreak, where they're shooting people trying to break quarantine. That has to be a key component to this conversation.
Well, you're absolutely right. And going back to that, they did go over the history of the use of biological weapons. As early, I think the one of the first ones that they had was a Roman garrison that was in what's now modern day Hungary. I don't know if you know anything, or not Hungary, Romania, southern Romania, north of what would be the Bosphorus today. And I don't know if you remember that, but that was actually a part of Rome, which is why the Romanians sound like Italians when they talk, right? Because they are descendants of that. They had a siege there, and it wasn't that they were sending in plague victims. They were catapulting dead animals and bodies in there that were rotting. And they knew that flies somehow would infect their food stores. Maggots would infect their food stores, and not just general pestilence would break out on the streets because they were under siege, so they couldn't go up to the top of the parapets and move all these bodies. And that, of course, created with the flies and mosquitoes and all the rest of the other biological vectors, which are things which spread a virus, that caused them to be in this besieged position where pestilence was now a weapon system used against them. So whether you might have been in a nice, comfortable siege house, right, with food, adequate water, and everything, they were terrified of these, of flies and maggots and other things, getting into the few gardens that they had, right, and doing we'll talk a little about agro-terrorism, where they use a biological vector into agriculture to kill your food supply. Same thing with water. If one of these, a dead goat lands into your well or is put there by an agent, you've now poisoned your water source. So same thing. It happened in the medieval period. It happened during the Crusades. It was a very common thing. If any of you watch Monty Python, it happened all the time, where people understood that by creating an environment in which disease was now a factor that was enhanced further than your regular run-of-the-mill, nasty medieval castle disease, then you, of course, create that, as you say, a psychological fulcrum upon which to break that force. Because then people are going to start cutting deals with you. You generally didn't win a siege because you battered down the walls or you catapulted them. You starved people out, and then the turncoats would be the first ones out the gate or through the sally port, and they would come and offer you information about the status of the siege in there, how the people are coping, the amount of food that they have. So you could also gather very, very good intelligence and then maybe increase the type of biological vector that you're sending in there. The medieval period was nasty anyway. I don't know if you've ever been into a Crusader castle. I've been to a few in the Middle East, and they were cold and dank, and even at their best, they were awful. So introduction of psychological terror as part of that is a key component as well. And with that point, Vince, I just want to mention something that occurred in June of 2001. And I wrote about this in my book. For any of you know that I'm an old schooler. This is a first edition of the first book I wrote, the Terrorist Recognition Handbook. And it's in its third edition. But I have in here an entire section on biological weapons. And one of the things that I did when I updated it in the 2000s was there was an exercise in June of 2001, just 3 months before 9/11, called Dark Winter. And I saw some of the debriefs on Dark Winter, and I have never been more frightened than reading about the Dark Winter exercise. Dark Winter was a U.S. government response exercise on a strategic scale, sponsored by USAMRIID, of course, in which smallpox was used as a terrorist weapon system through multiple infected terrorists who come to the United States, and they go around and all they do is touch people, cough on people, and get these biological vectors of smallpox spread across the country. Dark Winter had a computer modeling program that worked over every hour would represent a day in that exercise. And in fact, I think it was Senator Jack Kemp played the president in that exercise. I'm not sure if that's who actually played, but there was a United States senator playing the president of the United States, and he had to make decisions about how to defend the nation. In the simulation, in the first 14 days, using all the resources of the United States government, the United States reached 5,500 infections per day. The United States medical system, using these, I think it was 10 terrorists who spent weeks infecting hundreds of people, before people really realized smallpox was all over the United States, and that the U.S. hospital system collapsed in 14 days. That's where, which is why when the coronavirus came out, and Governor Cuomo here in New York State was talking about we're nearing the collapse of the system. It meant that that's where you would start losing more medical providers than you could put in, where more people would die or get infected than the system could handle, and then people would start dying in the streets.
Sorry, Malcolm, that's the assumption too. If a smart terrorist organization, and I'm not giving them ideas, this is written down, so don't blame me for this. A smart terrorist organization targets medical personnel, right? The first people are the nurses and the doctors, because if you're having a biological attack, you can collapse the system much faster than that by actually going after the medical personnel in the first place. And that's really what's so interesting about this type of warfare, is that the targets aren't satellites, they're not tanks, and they're not military personnel. The number one, the primary target are the people who can actually do something about it, and that's doctors and nurses.
Right. And smallpox is a very fast-burning disease, and that's one of the things we did in this course, is we went block by block of every horrible virus that there is. And if you recall the movie Outbreaks, the first scene of that movie is not them walking around Yosemite. The first scene is actually a quote by a Nobel Prize winning epidemiologist, and the quote is, the single greatest threat to the continued existence of man on this earth is the virus. And that movie was 1994, if I'm not mistaken. And the disease that they had in there was a hemorrhagic fever, Marburg. It was like Marburg virus, it was like Ebola. And when we went through this course, and they go through all the horrible things that can happen to you if you get Marburg virus or Ebola virus or any of these other hemorrhagic fevers, is that you realize some diseases are just too good at killing. Ebola is a very, very fast-killing disease. And in fact, the only way to get it really is to handle it. You have to actually touch people without medical equipment. And that's why when we had the Ebola outbreak in the 2000s, there were only 4 cases of Ebola that made its way to the United States. And if I'm not mistaken, 3 of those people were medical personnel who had gone to help on the Ebola mission, and their PPE, their personal protective equipment, failed them. Even though one person was a tourist from West Africa who was the first person who died from that. So when you see all these diseases, the level of lethality of these diseases is also a factor in how somebody would weaponize it. I'm sure at some point someone's going to ask me about this coronavirus, COVID-19, right? Which is just a new, novel, never seen before in history mutation of a coronavirus. And the reason we can't combat it is we don't know nothing about this disease. Everything that I was taught in that course, where they went through, again, every horrible virus that exists on the planet that could be weaponized, was a known factor. We know how to treat smallpox, for example. And even though Dark Winter exercise that I told you about ended up killing 2 million Americans in less than 30 days, that was with everything that we knew and everything we could throw at it. But this new novel coronavirus is, you hear people say, well, it's like the flu. Yeah, it is like the flu if the flu came from Mars. And that, by the way, was the scenario from the movie, the Andromeda strain. So this is not the Andromeda strain. It is of Earth. It's just we don't know anything about it. And so all of these things that we learn in this program, which we consider a person would do deliberately, which is get on an airplane and cough on people, spit on people, touch items that people would have from the snack bar. That is how terrorists would disperse these weapons. Whereas human dispersal itself, as we've learned in this program, and you'll learn, if you watch even some of these other, you know, the movie Contagion, for example. I'm keeping you in popular fiction because the movie Contagion was actually very good. And in that movie, what we called the virus in that movie is what they refer to as a nation killer, because no one knew anything about it. And what it was not like the flu, it was not like a typical coronavirus. It created a seizure which burned your brain and you would drop right there. You didn't die right away, right? It took you time to die. But what it had was the shock of people dying in the streets who were walking down the street, to the point where bodies were being left in the street. This, you know, this virus, fortunately, that we're dealing with, coronavirus, is a lot less lethal than that. But as you see, it has its own unique function, to the point where we're not sure how it does what it does, right? And that's why a terrorist group could not use this, because one, we're already on it. And one of the things that we find with terrorists is they like to do things that are new. Good example. There was a Japanese terrorist group in the 1980s called Shinrikyo. It was a very bizarre terrorist group. It was, in fact, a religious cult that was operating out of Japan that was recruiting some of the most brilliant minds in the country, young, disaffected people. They were also in many other countries, but their main government was in Japan, or their main organization body was in Japan, in a massive compound, because as a cult, they took all the money of their followers and they had hundreds of millions of dollars. But the leader, Shoko Asahara, who was a blind cleric who fashioned himself as sort of a half Jesus, half Buddha, weird cult group, actually got into his head that he wanted to kill everyone in the government of Japan. And so over a period of years, this group did some amazing biological terrorism weapon research. They actually bought, I believe it was a 1,000-acre sheep farm in rural northwest Australia, and they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sheep to use as biological weapon test beds. They actually went to an outbreak posing as humanitarians in Uganda, and went to this outbreak and tried to cultivate Ebola virus and bring it back to Japan with them to use as a weapon. And they were actually trying to test this, Ebola on their sheep. They actually didn't synthesize it and get it back. They actually tried. I keep saying actually. This group did it. They used they got biological weapons. There was a toxin that came from the green mamba snake. They were trying to harness this toxin and aerosolize it so that they could spread it over the city of Tokyo like a Japanese anime cartoon, which is what they eventually did, but with chemical weapons. And they wanted to kill the population of Tokyo. I mean, they had these grand ideas. But they also got hold of samples of Q fever, which comes from horses, and botulinum toxin, which, as you know, people inject into their face now. But they tried to get these to weaponize them by the hundreds of thousands of liters. None of this worked. But when they found, after they did their chemical weapons attack in the subways of Tokyo, which, by the way, was their third chemical weapon attack, they had actually used trucks with giant foggers spraying an unknown insecticide in the city of Nagano, I believe it was, that sickened hundreds of people. Then they managed to create a cyanide gas and release it in the Tokyo subway. Shoko Asahara has since been executed. The organization was torn down. They found that they had bought helicopters from Russia to disperse chemicals over the city of Tokyo. But their chief goal was to harness biological weapons. When they took over their compound in Australia, they found hundreds of dead sheep that they had been experimenting with biological weapons with. So these things do exist within that continuum that an individual group could get that.
Well, Malcolm, let me ask you this.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what you're saying is interesting, because this group was able to prepare and to purchase these items for years and years and years without being spotted. And again, I could compare this to nuclear weapons, which is, so different because there are certain things that no one needs unless they're trying to make a nuclear weapon. There's certain things that are clear, right? The intelligence agencies can spot you if you're buying certain things. Biological weapons, biological infrastructure is so dual use that, when talking about synthetic biology, there are universities and companies and individuals around the world ordering genes and ordering different biological agents that aren't necessarily for killing people. It's almost impossible to tell which people or organizations are pursuing peaceful research for defensive purposes and which ones are up to no good. Do intelligence agencies have the tools necessary to stop something like this? I mean, this is something where you don't have a smoking gun. You don't have a massive Natanz nuclear production facility in Iran, right? This is something that you can now rent out, university level biological laboratories by the hour here outside of DC. And I think of, talked about the coronavirus, and the coronavirus is not killing as many people because it's so weak, right? If you can kill it with ivory snow, if you can kill it, with your hand soap, then it's a pretty weak virus. But I can imagine, and I'm not the first one to do this, so don't write me nasty letters, I can imagine trying to genetically engineer something like this to be much stronger, to be much more, basically the self-defense of the virus itself to be capable of withstanding some of the basics. And that would be a complete nightmare, again, looking at the last 4 months here in the United States.
There's been a lot of talk, and I believe there's an online documentary about gene splitting. But there are these amateur gene splitters. Or was I on 60 Minutes? But there was a program recently about gene splitters and how these people do rent out these biolabs or a garage or a rental, a storage unit, and they're in there and using advanced computer technology and some very simple machines that you can buy from China, in an atomic microscope. You can actually go in and genetically modify genes. For example, I believe it was the scientist who had claimed that he had cloned a human embryo or a human egg, did it without the complete knowledge of the government of China, which is a communist totalitarian regime that pretty much keeps its eye on everything. He used the private lab to do that, right? So you could do that. I mean, it's possible. Okay, hark back to popular fiction. This is where the old school James Bond type intelligence collection actually happens. I mean, a guy like Hans Stavro Blofeld with a giant ship that splits into two, or other guys who are launching spaceships into space to steal rockets, we have intelligence collection systems that can get that. Valerie Plame, famous CIA officer who was outed by the Bush administration, led a 100-person unit that was a research group whose sole function was to track down those nuclear triggers, try to find out who was buying a quarter ton of RDX high explosive, because that's what it takes to create fusion or fission in an atomic bomb. That's the easy stuff. But when you're talking about people that are on Etsy or buying components off of eBay, which you can do, you can buy an entire biolab that's gone out of business. Some state agencies and environmental organizations will sell you everything you need if you're skilled enough to know what you need. Okay? The way that people tend to screw up and why we get to detect them, thankfully, social media is one of those things. I mean, if you have somebody who's posting his great admiration of the 2001 anthrax attack, right? And how he could, and he's doing research on modifying anthrax or working in animal husbandry disease management, those are intelligence indicators. But him just working on animal husbandry disease management by itself is nothing. We cannot collect against that. You as a terrorist, or you as a person who is logisticking for that terrorist, will give us the indicators that something is going on. Or, I don't know if very interesting thing that I liked about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They bragged. I mean, they would have a whole PowerPoint, right? They would have an entire video about how they harnessed terrorist weapons. Al-Qaeda had that. Al-Qaeda had videos of where they were, using choking agents and other things that they were injecting into dogs, cats, goats, and mammals at the Junta terrorist training facility. Granted, a B-52 squadron put an end to that. I was actually on that site, and there was no way to get to anything that existed there before. It was all in Russian tunnels, and it was literally buried by the tens of thousands of metric tons. We pray to God that terrorists use systems like that, right? You have a secret terror lair, like my man skiff here, that you would go there and then somebody would see something you're doing. That's how we knew Al-Qaeda was carrying out chemical, biological weapons attacks. And they were having development. And they were having meetings with the top nuclear guy in Pakistan, who was sympathetic to their cause. So these are how we get these indicators. But a single guy who decides that he's going to end the world and sets out to that could, in fact, create a disease that, that will only detect when it starts to vector out into the population. But it has to have a basis of something. So nothing is really novel unless, it's the Andromeda strain, right? It literally comes from space on a rock, and we touch it, and it powderizes all of your blood. But, by the way, the Andromeda strain research facility, that's the facility all the USAMR guys wish they had. That movie's a big joke. It's like, oh, we wish we had that place. So, but Outbreaks is a very good representation of all the containment levels that USAMR operates. It's actually a good primer, that movie, unless you're a research scientist.
Well, I mean, these are interesting movies that a lot of people now obviously are watching more than they would otherwise, not only because they have time to, but because why not? These are
why not?
Outbreak and Andromeda strain. And again, one of the common themes in all of them, and this is something I brought up a little bit before, but I want to touch upon it more, is just with a completely natural virus like we have now, there has been social unrest. And I don't mean from the last 2 weeks. I mean disagreements about staying in and going out, and people getting upset at the government, and people not willing to use the basics in PPE or masks because they think it's government overreach. And in the kind of, when you have a country like the United States, you run into this, I'm free to do what I want, you can't tell me what to do. I think of that as a potential catastrophic problem with something much more virulent than what we're dealing with now, something that we even have this opportunity to kill by just washing our hands. As an intelligence officer, let me put you in the shoes of intelligence officers around the world, looking at the United States and the response to the coronavirus. Now, there's no country that is openly doing biological weapons research. I use the word openly. Obviously, the Russians are still working on it because they're killing people with it. But as an intelligence officer, if you're a Russian intelligence officer, if you're a North Korean intelligence officer, if you're Iranian, if you're working for ISIS as an intelligence officer, what are you learning from our response to the coronavirus?
Well, something that I think that a lot of our adversaries had learned a while ago. It's just that now it's being revalidated. Interestingly, the best example of how you could break a nation is not the coronavirus itself. It's our response to false information. It's the weaponization of freedom of speech. The Soviet Union just could not get down how to disperse false information. They just couldn't do it. And everything that came out of their country was patently considered a lie. But within 10 years of the Soviet Union collapsing and rabid capitalist oligarchs taking over, being led by an ex-KGB officer who is very smart ex-communist, who agrees with all the goals of the Soviet Union about getting rid of the United States democracy in the West, they realize technology is a lever respond to. So some of you know I'm famous for 3 books that I wrote about the Russian hacking in the United States, The Plot to Hack America being the first book. And I've said this 1,000 times on television, and I'll say it to you today. They did not hack just the Democratic National Committee. That was just their physical theft of information. What they were hacking, the strategic objective, was to hack your mindset, to hack your belief system, to hack your ability to believe what you see in front of your lying eyes, if that field could be filled with lies that gave you an alternate reality. So now the reason I'm bringing up information is that in a biological attack, or as we're seeing right now with this massive, we're still in phase 1 of a massive global pandemic. We haven't even reached the 1918 part of this pandemic. I mean, we're still in the first couple of months, and we have people who do not believe it exists because they have harnessed onto the weaponization of information, the weaponization of freedom of speech, which means any lie that's out there is of equal weight to the truth that are being told to you by the smartest people in this country. So that combination of things, if I were a targeteer, right, or as some agencies call it, targeters, but in the military, we call it targeteers, and I were to be asked for a strategic assessment of how could we use what's happening now against the United States to further our strategic goals, to damage liberal democracy, small L liberal democracy, as it has existed in the United States since 1783 when the Constitution was ratified. How do we do it? Well, it's simple. We make you not believe a dang thing you are told. That weaponization is ongoing. There have been multiple reports from the House, the Senate, the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, the Mueller report that has all sat in front of you and said the Russians have weaponized your ability to believe what's happening through propaganda, active measures, distribution of false information. Now you won't put on a mask because you believe that that's some sort of claptrap that the man has told you. And what you do is you now, on average, infect 21 to 40 people. If this was a terrorist attack, the dead would be stacking up left and right. The difference between what's happening now is it's such a slow roll. It takes you 2 weeks to have the infection. You could start showing symptoms within 3 to 5 days. You feel bad. It could be mild. It could be dead, right? But if you don't see it, if you're not watching people fall dead in the streets by, like we called it, a nation killer virus, a virus that will take down 100 million people, then this weaponization of freedom of speech allows a foreign intelligence adversary to make you believe there's nothing wrong.
Right. Well, I'm sure there's tons of questions out there. Before, as Amanda comes in and starts to ask questions, let me thank you, Malcolm. You showed great restraint in taking 20 minutes before you mentioned your first book, and another 20 minutes before you brought up your other ones. I really appreciate. You really showed some, real patience and restraint there. And then before we move to the questions, please, again, all of you join us tonight. We have another fascinating conversation at 5:30 that Amanda will talk about later on, but I wanted to catch everybody before we jumped into the questions. So Amanda, take it away.
Sure.
And Vince, I don't think you've mentioned either of your books, so kudos to you. So anyway, we have lots of cool questions, lots of good conspiracy theories for you to just crush, Malcolm.
Yeah, crush them all.
I'm going to try to ask these in order in which, and this is so neat. This is a great history question, not a conspiracy question. This is a question about the politicization, which is tricky to say, of this flu. And was there a politicization, I think I didn't say it right either time, of the Spanish flu in 1918? I thought that was an intriguing question.
Yes, I believe that the whole reason that we call it the Spanish flu is because it was politicized.
Right, Spain was the only one that would have. Yeah.
Yeah, Spanish flu of 1918 actually started in 1917.
And it didn't start in Spain, right? I mean, the idea was Spain was the only country to acknowledge that they were being hit because the warring countries of World War I didn't want to acknowledge that they were being infected by this. So this poor Spanish, it's not their fault. It didn't even start in Spain. It wasn't the worst place.
Yeah. But that's political right there.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
That the warring countries wouldn't acknowledge their losses. So
they didn't want this to impact their war fighting position. Interesting historic fact, as some of you know, my family has had a Nance in every war, nonstop in the armed forces since 1864. My grandfather and my grand uncle were both African American soldiers serving in France in World War I, and in massive units. My grandfather was a stevedore, and my grand uncle was a teamster. He actually drove teams of 8 horses, and they would take ammunition out to the front in the Marne and Saint Mihiel, and they would bring dead bodies back. How they did not get the Spanish flu. They twice went on troop ships in the same year with thousands of other soldiers and managed to survive returning to the United States when this thing was savaging 50 million people. It would just like point to a person, and in that famous case where a grandmother dies at 6 a.m. and all 9 of the other family members were dead by the time the doctor arrived at 6 p.m. It's just utterly amazing. But yeah, politics plays a role in just about everything.
I mean, it's interesting because people not sharing the statistics, and we hear lots about our countries releasing their real numbers, but it is interesting to see it globally, even if maybe the numbers are not, as we can see, the accounting is very tricky, but it is interesting that it seems like countries are releasing their numbers when they can.
True. And I mean, you can tell the countries that when they release their numbers and then they suddenly stop, that they've got a very, very big problem. That's an intelligence indicator, right? Free flow of information, suddenly the door closes and they start saying we have no problems, as numbers. Brazil is a good example of that. China is a good example of that because the Chinese are a communist nation, right? They have the ability, even though they're making lots of capitalist money, they are a centrally controlled nation. And, the numbers that they had reported were almost incredible for a nation of 1.5 billion people. Whereas the United States, we could clearly see that half the nation refused to believe that this was real. At least 40% of this country refuses to believe that it's real. We had leadership say that it was a hoax. And we have just broke 2 million infections today, and we'll probably be at 200,000 dead by August, not the 60,000 as it was reported. But then you have people saying, well, let's not test so those numbers don't go up. That's literally saying, I'm going to not get out of my car so that Reaper drone's missile won't get me. Okay? If the missile is on its way, you're going to get blown up, right? Same thing with a virus. You cannot pretend it does not exist. What you have to do is what the intelligence community has been warning you. Intentions and warning. This is what we do. It's tell you so you can take action and defend yourself and help defend the nation by wearing a mask.
Well, now let's get to some of the conspiracy or just thoughts or comments or ideas. One of things. Yay! This is the really juicy part. So we've got a question about one of the conspiracy theories that it has Fort Detrick lab in Frederick, Maryland, near Frederick, Maryland, being to blame. It was closed for a while, and there was a spill of the virus, and then it was exported to Wuhan. Have you heard that one? Do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I do. Okay, listen, people. Okay, the easiest thing in the world I want you. You know what? One of the things that I have prominently figured in my book, the Terrorist Recognition Handbook, under intelligence analysis is common sense is the least used intelligence analysis tool. Right? I mean, common sense thing. All right. USAMRIID, which is where Fort Detrick is. Fort Detrick, Maryland, is where the Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases is headquartered. It is a level 4 biocontainment facility. It is equal in anything that the CDC has, right? If it escaped from Fort Detrick, there would be a trail of bodies going from Fort Detrick across an airliner all the way to Wuhan, China, which would be for what reason? To spread the disease, to blame it on the Chinese? You don't have to do this. All I want you to do is go to YouTube, and I want you to look up wet market documentary. And this is a documentary, a very serious one. BBC did one. Other programs, TV5 in France did one, where they go into these markets where bizarre meats are being eaten and harvested, badger and, oryx and crazy things back. And we know that many of these coronaviruses leap from the human consumption of benign viruses in animals. They don't affect the animals, but when they get into a human, they modify themselves and they move. So common sense, folks.
Yeah, so there's nothing like a fresh badger when you haven't had one for a while. But this is not the first time that people have tried to blame the Americans for this. I mean, the famous one is in the 1980s when the KGB and the Stasi tried to blame HIV/AIDS on the same U.S. Army AMRI group. My common sense is even simpler than this. If we built it, it wouldn't be this easy to kill. I know it sounds intuitive, but a well-manufactured biological weapon would not be killed by Irish Spring. It would be much more difficult to, if you genetically engineer a virus like this, it would be very different, in my opinion.
Hey, Vince, are you working for these soap companies now?
She works for Purell.
I'm trying to get a side gig here, just in case. Soap's not
all right. What are the others
anytime soon?
Okay, now this one is asking, and I hope I don't sound like, I appreciate everyone's questions, so I don't want anyone to feel dismissed in my presentation of the questions. But this one is saying, even though the pandemic, the virus comes from a natural source, are there any indications that it was intentionally spread by the Chinese against their own people to, make its way to the West?
That's another one of those conspiracy theories that was very early on, that the Chinese had it in the lab at Wuhan. It either jumped out, it broke through all the containment barriers, somebody got the disease, went out and started having it. I want to say, I literally just wrote this in a book that I'm writing, or a new edition of my book, where the person who was the first Chinese medical person to identify this was an ophthalmologist in Wuhan. And he had people that were coming in and they had these horrible, symptoms. They had, deep coughs and all these things. And he realized within a couple of weeks, all of his patients were dying, right? And he was communicating with some of his alumnus from his university on this network, where they were saying, hey, this isn't SARS, right? This isn't sudden acute respiratory arrest syndrome, or MERS, Middle East respiratory arrest syndrome, which came from camels in Saudi Arabia. This is something new. And then the first thing that happened was, the Chinese monitor all his communications, and they came in and shut him down. And later on, it would turn out that he was right about everything, and then would die from the virus. If it had been something that leaped over the firewall, it likely would have infected a lot more people. Why would the government of China need to, release a virus that could kill them and their families? When you release a virus, this is literally like setting your house on fire at every level, and then when it's fully fully engaged, you can see the flames outside the window. Right? There's no stopping it at that point. It's going to burn something to the ground, or you're going to get in there early enough to knock it down. More likely, look, in the Great Cultural Revolution, the Chinese, how many people did they kill, Vince? Some crazy number, like 10 million?
No, much higher than that. But yeah, so they've been much more efficient in killing their own population than this.
I mean, you want to kill your population, just send them off to, create a new Great Wall of China. You'll kill 100,000 just in construction accidents. That's ridiculous.
Well, and Amanda, the big picture issue is also about prestige in this case, is that right now, soft power matters so much in the world. And this is a step back for the Chinese in the soft power struggle to convince the rest of the world that they're the leader moving into the 21st century. If they are killing all these people because they lost this virus, that hurts. Now they have an opportunity to move in places and provide, like the Russians did, care and PPE and stuff like that. But this is egg on their face, right? This is a virus that started in China, and that's not something they want to do right now.
Yeah. If it was a James Bond movie, it would be a Chinese industrialist who runs all the biomedical labs, and he wants to be the dominant medical authority and the dominant medical producer in the world. He buys up all the mass companies, then he releases the virus. But this thing jumps naturally, and it flows naturally. So it's not released by anybody. Nature is good at this.
This leads to a good, someone wants to know why in today's world where containment is so difficult, why even pursue using biological weapons?
Well, for the terror factor. And now, the thing is, there are very few terror groups that can actually pull this off. We've seen examples of NeoNazis in the United States just in the last month talk about going around and spitting on Jews and going and getting deliberately infected with coronavirus. Yeah, that's real. I believe that came from an arrest where they were on their little Nazi web, and they were talking about spreading this to get rid of our enemies. That's fundamental. We've seen examples of crazy people who were angry at the police because they had to wear a mask and then say, cough and try to touch this cop. There's a famous video of the woman who's trying to touch the cop, and the cop tasers her. And I mean, humans are stupid, and they will not look out for their own interests.
Amanda, the fear among experts is that with things like CRISPR, which is the gene splicing technology,
right,
our knowledge of genetics moving forward, that some country, some entity will be able to biologically engineer a weapon that only goes after a certain ethnic group, or where you create a biological weapon that we're completely, like Malcolm, me, you, completely immune to, but anyone with Arab heritage, is susceptible to, or Asian, or vice versa.
Disease.
That is where that's what keeps people at the Pentagon up at night, is the ability to genetic. Because you look, I mean, African Americans are disproportionately affected by coronavirus. Now, 90% of that is due to economic and issues where the healthcare is worse. But people are looking at it saying, can we explain that 100% due to bad economic issues? Maybe, maybe not. There's certainly people looking into it, like, is there a particular gene sequence within corona that African Americans are more affected by? That's the nightmare scenario. And that's,
or I was just going to say that leads into what I think has to be our final question. It actually sort of pre-answers some of it, but people want to know what other bioterrorism threats you see facing the nation. That's certainly incredibly one of them. Vince, are there others that we can just terrorize ourselves with as we close out here?
Well, there's something called zoonotic. There's zoonotic biohazards. Essentially, those are things that can be transferred from animals to humans and vice versa.
Right.
And so there are a lot of biological organisms out there that only affect animals. Think of hoof and mouth disease, or think of certain things that will kill your livestock, but you could walk up to an infected cow and touch it and do whatever. And you can even eat the meat in some cases and not catch disease. There are also diseases that are easily transferred from animals to humans, but they're not that lethal, right? They might give you the sniffles, they might make you feel bad for a couple of days, but they don't kill you. The fear in the future for a lot of people is either you genetically modify the horrible like hoof and mouth type diseases that don't transfer from animals to humans to create a situation where they can transfer from animals to humans, or you engineer a very weak, non-lethal virus that already easily transmits from animals to humans and then makes it lethal. So that really opens up worms where, you know, you have a huge, say you have a massive outbreak of hoof and mouth disease throughout Texas cattle country, and all of a sudden it starts hitting humans. No one's prepared for that, right? There would not be because biological science for the last 500 years says this disease does not affect humans, and it certainly is not transferred from animals to humans. And that would be, talk about a novel virus, one that was created in a laboratory.
Right. It would be like if MERS, like again, it came from Saudi Arabia, it started around camels. Like if MERS was an engineered weapon, right? And they spread it around the world. But the easiest biological weapon to use is the one that doesn't exist. And that is to pretend or create a psychological operation to make people think that there's something out there, right? And a lot of these, I mean, sorry, we think like this in the spy world, right? This is, you sort of fake out or punk out people to believe that there's this massive outbreak. Let me tell you something. The videos that I have seen come from my friends in Europe that are originating in the United States out there about Bill Gates created this weapon, and here's the Rothschilds and the Bilderbergs are all funding this in order to dominate the world. You can't dominate the world if everyone's dead. But they show edited video that makes you think that that all the riots that are happening now are pandemic related. Very soon, in a couple of weeks, there will be a spike in infections across the United States of people that were at these presentations. But more importantly, we're already seeing a massive increase in 17 states of the people who don't believe it and all wanted to go back to work. But there will be a lot of media that will claim that the next wave of this, the second wave, which could kill 300,000 Americans, which could kill your mother or your sister or whatever, will have come from these protests.
Right.
And that will create a situation which will destabilize a nation. There are intelligence professionals who are all James Bond evil villains, right? And their letters start with the letter F, S, and B. And they have nothing to do but to try to topple democratic norms, the Western democracy that we all live in and love, the same way they did it in the Soviet Union, but in this case, to earn money by making the greatest nation on earth look like a weak, ineffective country. And we're doing a good job helping them.
Well, even though I love you, you can depress me, Malcolm, but
my job, I do it well.
You do it well, and I just am so glad that you were both here today to talk to us about this. We didn't get to nearly enough of the questions. We will try to share those with you later if you want to, either of you, follow up with anybody via email. We can't promise anything, but some really, really cool questions. As Vince mentioned earlier, we have a great program at 5:30. He's got Jack Barsky, who was an undercover KGB spy in the United States, and the daughter that he had, who's now grown up, but was the reason he decided to not go back to the Soviet Union. So the Barsky family happy hour is going to be really cool.
There'll be a lot less conversation about biological weapons on that one.
Yeah, which some of us will miss. And then next week at this time, we will have a spy chat with our executive director, Chris Costa, and his guest will be Keith Mosbach, and they'll be looking at all the latest news, but Keith will bring a geospatial, geointelligence perspective. So that will be very cool.
I love GeoInt.
I know, and Keith does a great job with it.
Spooky space camera stuff.
Yeah, so thank you both, and thanks everyone for being here, and we hope to see you later. All right, take care.